Well, Darwin, I think he was born in 1812, but I might have that wrong, but in the early 1800s. And he became enormously interested in just the natural world, collecting specimens, making notes of them, investigating what was going on in his surroundings, and we're talking about in England. And so he had a passionate interest in wildlife and other life, of course. And I think he went to Cambridge and did a degree, intending, I think, to be a minister as his career. And I'm not sure of the actual date, but he wasn't all that old and he hadn't married or anything like that. And Fitzroy was to take this voyage in the Beagle and map the coast of South America. And he wanted a company of somebody. So really Darwin was being chosen to be a companion to Fitzroy. He wasn't being chosen for anything natural or biological. And so they leave England and they head over to South America, and I think Darwin found the voyages and being on the boat very upsetting. He used to get seasick, etc., etc. But he was fascinated by the enormous variety of the natural world that he was seeing. And while Fitzroy was mapping the coast up and down, and this took 3 years up and down both sides of South America, Darwin spent a lot of time on land collecting specimens, seeing what was there, and getting a real look at a whole world of the natural world. And the boat was under instructions to then return round the world, meaning it would go across the Pacific, and they went to the Galapagos, which of course was a fascinating little series of islands with different species on it, and that he found very fascinating. They did come across the Pacific and they did briefly call into Australia, but they were really heading on their way home. And when Darwin got back to England, he had a massive amount of specimens that were sent to him, and he was, he'd seen incredible things. So he started to mull over on all these animals and plants and things that he'd seen, and he started to he wanted to have some explanation of how all these different animals and plants existed, and he was aware of course, artificial selection that humans have been doing with domestic animals and those sorts of things. And he had this little brainwave one day that, of course, there would be natural selection going on. Lots of animals and plants produced, but only some survive. And the ones that survive would have features that would help their survival, and those features, we assume, will get passed on. And so he nurtured these ideas, and others were talking about these things, but he realised that he was moving away from the God made the world idea, and it was all in place sort of thing. So, and his wife was quite religious. Oh, he married, of course, by this stage, and settled down to a life of really just looking at plants and animals and mulling over all the things he'd seen and writing papers and books and bits and pieces. And he was nurturing this idea of selection. He realised there was, in nature, selection was going on. And because of his wife was religious, and that was an important sort of, relationship he had with her, he didn't push it. And it was a bit of a challenging idea to really oppose the religious interpretation of life. So he only spoke to some of his colleagues who had, who he could talk to these ideas about. And it must have been in the late 1850s, 1858, something like that. There was another man his name was Alfred Russel Wallace, who'd gone on a collecting tour, or not tour, that's the wrong way to put it, excursion, trip, and he he wasn't an upper middle class sort of person. He needed the money to collect the specimens and pay for his life and so on. And he was going through what do you call those islands north of Australia? I've forgotten what you call them. Indonesia and those islands up there. And he had the idea of, looks like there's a sort of selection going on. So he writes an account of natural selection, and because he'd had a little bit of contact with Darwin, he sends Darwin a copy, and of course Darwin goes, someone's beaten me to it. So what's agreed is that the Linnaean Society would have the papers on natural selection, one from Wallace and one from Darwin, presented at their annual meeting in, I think, 1858, if I've remembered that correctly. And in fact, the chairman of the meeting said nothing very interesting happened at our meeting. And then Darwin worked like mad to produce The Origins of the Species, the book that he's sort of best known for. And of course, he could see how animals were like each other, and far more offspring were produced than would survive, and in different circumstances they'd be selected for different features. So he had a lot of evidence as he put together in this little book, and it was published, I think, in 1859. But in the meantime, somebody anonymously had written a book called The Vestiges of Creation, and this was a sort of an idea like natural selection, but not using those words, and it caused a huge furore in the public in England, and they talked about it, and it sold it in piles of copies and so on. In fact, it was really a highly exciting sort of thing to discuss, these vestiges of creation. And the scientific-y sort of people were very dismissive of it. They said, this is, there's no author, we don't want to have anything to do with this. But Darwin was aware that ideas he had been nurturing were being thrown up. And that book, Vestiges of Creation, actually outsold Darwin's book on natural selection almost up to 1900, which is quite staggering when you think about it. But what Darwin didn't know, he knew nothing about genes and chromosomes or any of that sort of inheritance thing. So he could see selection, and he could argue for selection, but he didn't understand the mechanisms in a chromosomal genetic way. But his groundwork in the book that he wrote on the origin, by natural selection, it really is a remarkable book, quite an outstanding piece of publication. And that's why we look back and see Darwin as a key contributor to this idea that has just been enlarged and backed up ever since. And Wallace had a few funny ideas, so he sort of didn't really attract such a lot of interest, because he had a few wacky ideas, I think. And also, he wasn't of a class, an middle to upper class person. It was, what England's like, very class orientated. So if you're in the right class, you get more credit for whatever's going on. So Darwin's contribution to the idea of evolution, not that he used the word that much. He used the word selection and those sorts of things, but not evolution. He didn't use that very much. But in America in particular, there's a lot of fundamentalist type belief and so on. And the people in America, or the kind of free thinker type people in America, said, let's have a Darwin Day and we'll celebrate the ideas that Darwin put forward about natural selection, evolution of animals and plants. And so they started the idea. I think it wasn't until the 1990s or something, I don't know the exact date. And it spread in America, and then more widely, to the point where it's among free-thinking atheists, humanists and so on, the idea of a Darwin Day has been celebrated for quite a few years. So that's how we come to be here today, to celebrate Darwin Day, which of course is Darwin's birthday, the 12th of February.
Well, how does Darwin's theory of natural selection underpin the modern humanist worldview, in your opinion?
Well, the modern humanist worldview is one of not going to supernatural causes for anything and just going on what's the information that we can get hold of, and that's all there is to the world as we understand it as humanists. So Darwin, of course, that's what he was talking about. And so we see, I mean, it's really fundamentally explaining where animals and plants and people have come from. So Darwin's a very crucial person. So, you know, someone humanists would reasonably admire.
Can you elaborate on the contrast between pre-Darwinian and post-Darwinian worldviews, especially in terms of human understanding of life forms and their origins?
Well, I mean, in the context of European countries, Christianity, with an explanation of God making things, would have been a pretty widely held view. And when you don't know the age of the Earth or anything, you can calculate it and say it was, you know, only 5,000 years ago or something rather foolish like that. But we know it's, I think it's thousands of millions of years old, the Earth, and life too. And life began fairly simply and took a long time to become more complex over the years. Does that answer that?
Yeah, I mean, it would be very hard for people who, you know, have a lifespan of like 50 to 80, seeing that, like to digesting such a long history of evolution.
Of course, I know what you're saying, but if you take the humanist view that there is no supernatural sort of layer to anything, you've only got the living things, and how all the living things function in pretty similar ways, really. So you can see how they're related, and obviously it takes a long time to put them all in place. So yes, but mind you, humans probably only Homo sapiens, which we seem to belong to, only probably go back about 300,000 years when we haven't been. There have been other human-like things, but we're only fairly recent,
That's true.
generally speaking. Making a mess of everything too.
Hopefully we can use the same powers of what caused this mess.
Well, you do wonder though. I mean, I've been around long enough to know that there was far more like insect life around than there has been now. I mean, I can remember when I was just a kid, we'd go driving somewhere up into the country and your window screen would just get smothered with insects. That doesn't happen much anymore. They're really dropping off. It's a bit of a worry.
Well, in what way do you think Darwin's work has contributed to the shift from a more theocentric to a more humanistic or human-centric understanding of life and morality?
Well, it gives you an explanation for the longevity of life on Earth into hundreds of, if not thousands of millions of years. And that's almost outside of our comprehension, quite frankly. I mean, we only, you know, if we're lucky, we'll get 100 years individually. And you can only remember, and you can only grasp so much out of that. You just have to accept that life's been around a very long time and it changes as circumstances change. And all those God ideas are just made up by humans, wanting there to be a God controlling everything. But it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, if you see that plants and living things can function without having some overview, somebody directing things. Not necessary.
Well, how does Darwin's theory of evolution challenge the traditional religious and hierarchical notions of human superiority and the great chain of being?
Well, it's a completely different way of looking at things. And if you go back to the great chain of being and the hierarchy and all those, they were ways of understanding the role of humans amongst all the rest of the living world, and we were seen as some superior thing that had come out on top, and we were in control of it all. These were the theological, religious-y type views, but that's really not the case. I mean, that we can do so much is one thing, but it's not the same as being in control or in charge. We're definitely not. I mean, we're making a total mess of it. Really, I think.
What are the key ways in which Darwin's theory has influenced contemporary ethical and moral reasoning?
I'm not so sure it's had such a huge influence, really. It's a bit of a vexed area, morals and ethics and things like that. I mean, we are social animals. So the best type of behaviour is behaviour where we interact as social beings, because that's the most successful way that we will help others and we will get satisfaction and in connection with other people. We're not isolates in any sense, but all of that's just what will help us live well and thrive and hopefully rear another generation.
Do you think Darwin has an impact on ongoing conflicts between religious and secular perspectives in society?
I don't think anymore. Well, I mean, other than people who talk in terms of there being natural evolution of life, not directed from a God type being. I don't know how to answer that, but I mean, I think Darwin probably gave up a lot of his own religious beliefs, particularly when one of his beloved daughters died. I think she was 8 or 9, and I think he was quite distraught by that. But of course his wife was religious, so he sort of played along with things. And isn't he buried in Westminster Cathedral?
I've been there, Westminster Abbey.
Westminster Abbey, yeah. You know, I've been there, but I don't think I saw Darwin's. What's it? It's on the ground,
yeah,
is it?
On the ground. As far as I remember, it was a long time ago, 2012. And yeah, I just remember seeing him there. His name, I think, in copper on the ground.
Just a tribute to him from his birth, death sort of yeah. I mean, he really did make a remarkable contribution. And of course he wrote quite a few other books as well, and really did. He seemed to have had a fair idea about atolls, coral atolls, and how they were formed, and a whole lot of other things. Barnacles.
Well, in celebration of Darwin's Day, what aspects of Darwin's life and work do you think are most important for fostering a great appreciation of science and reason in society?
Well, just that if you work in a scientific way of collecting the evidence and reasoning what it all means, that is very consistent with a humanist point of view. And I think that's why we celebrate Darwin, because he devoted his life to collecting the evidence, seeing what was going on in respect to things that he could look at. Barnacles and other things that he did study when he and I think he was a very good natural philosopher, I think he was called, rather than a scientist, but we think of him as a scientist. And he was quite a remarkable person and worth celebrating, very much so.